I'm talking about centering equity in climate resilience planning and action. This is a project of NOAA, Antioch University, New England, and Fernleaf. Together, we worked on creating a practitioner's guide on centering equity. The original project came about as a need to update NOAA's climate resilience toolkit. And then we quickly realized that equity needed a whole separate guide that wouldn't just be a supplement, but kind of be a reframing of the climate resilience toolkit. We seem to be talking a lot about flooding today, so I'm going to tell you my flooding story. I've spent the last 5 years living in Detroit, Michigan. I'm currently living in Maryland. But when I was living in Detroit, the city experienced a lot of flooding. On the morning of June 21, 2021, I woke up to 9 inches of floodwater in my basement. Over 6 inches of rain had fallen overnight in the city, and the city declared a state of emergency. And over 49,000 households were impacted by the floods. This was really a devastating event. We personally, I wasn't able to have any hot water or air conditioning in my home for a month. People experienced tens of thousands of dollars in damage. A lot of them did not have insurance. Many of them were denied FEMA funding for the repairs. Even now, 2 years later, we are still dealing with this event. This is a map showing a few years ago, they did a survey on Detroit residents, and it showed that 46% of the households in the city were impacted by flooding at some point in the last 4 years. So to understand why this happened, it's really helpful to look into the history of the city itself and at the inequities that have created Detroit what it is today. As you can see, Detroit is located in between Lake Erie and Lake Huron. There's a river that connects these two lakes. And here is in relation to New York. It's a really huge city covering 136,000 miles, but the population is actually quite small. Today it is about 660,000 people. The city was founded in 1701, and the Iroquois nation had settled it before the French colonized it, and then it became an American settlement in the 1700s. It was incorporated as a city. It experienced rapid growth due to its strategic location along the Great Lakes waterway and became a center for shipping, shipbuilding, manufacturing. In 1901, Henry Ford built the first automobile there, and then Detroit became the center of the automobile industry in the 20th century. So here we are, population 639,000. The metro area of Detroit is actually 4.3 million. That includes all of the surrounding suburbs. So only 14% of the residents in the metro area live in the city itself. So during the 20th century, after the auto industry grew really big in Detroit, there was a ton of migration to Detroit. By that time, the city was already very prosperous, had a big building industry. And then in the 20th century, there was huge waves of migration from the South, both Black and white immigrants. There were also Eastern European immigrants, Asian immigrants, Latino immigrants, all moving to Detroit to seek opportunity. And by the 1950s, the city had reached a peak population. And at that time, it was the 4th largest city in the country. And then the city started to see a decline. So First, what happened was there was a lot of racial tension as a result of all this immigration. White people tended to get the better jobs, while Black people and other immigrants were relegated lower level factory jobs. Unequal housing policies like redlining also prevented Blacks from owning homes in white neighborhoods. Blacks were prevented from moving into other neighborhoods and were forced to live in these very tight conditions, deteriorating conditions in the middle of the city. And then in the 1950s, the city started a highway building program, and the highways were designated to go through right through the middle of the city, through these very important Black neighborhoods. And because these neighborhoods were so dense and so neglected at the time, it was seen as a revitalization project, even though there were many thriving Black businesses and homes. And those areas were demolished to build the highway. And as a result, Black residents were pushed into other neighborhoods throughout the city, and the white people, fearing the integration, they left the city altogether, many of them, and moved into the suburbs. This led to a decrease in the tax base for the city, and an economic decline that lasted into the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So this is a map showing the 2010 racial census data. It's incredibly segregated, even today. So the green represents Black residents, and then blue is white. And then we have in here a pocket of mostly Middle Eastern residents, and then Latino quarters down here. So Detroit is still about 95% African American, and white people have mostly moved to the suburbs surrounding the city. So there is a lot of blight in the city, with properties that have been abandoned because of the lack of the tax base. Taxes became even higher, which made more people move out of the city. So there are huge tracts of Detroit where the homes are kind of like in this picture, or it's just abandoned lots, and there's been a lot of demolishment. So here you can see kind of the economic inequality that currently exists. We have median household income in Detroit, it's around 31,000. And then in Michigan, it's at 56,000. The median family income difference between Detroit and the rest of Michigan. And then Wayne County, which is mostly Detroit, versus Oakland County, which is a neighboring suburb. Detroit has seen a lot of revitalization in the last 10 years. The city has focused a lot on redeveloping the downtown. The big skyscrapers you see right here are the Renaissance Center, which was built in the 1970s. And it has this beautiful waterfront, which has been rated the #1 waterfront in the country. Also more condos and businesses have gone up in the downtown and midtown areas, even though the surrounding neighborhoods still experience a lot of poverty and blight. And where you see white people biking, you know that an area is being gentrified. Also, the property values have gone up. So you can see like where property values were very depressed in 2012, it has gone up steadily over the last decade. So I tell the story to show that understanding the historic context of a community is incredibly important when understanding how a community got to where it is, why it's inequitable today, and how can climate adaptation address inequality. We know that climate change affects everyone, but the impacts are not experienced equally across populations. Black, Latino, Indigenous populations experience more harms from climate change. And we can see if you live in housing that's aging and has crumbling infrastructure, you're going to be dealing with more problems when there's flooding, and those homes are probably located in more flood-prone zones. The communities have distrust in the government because there's been a lot of corruption. The homes are often behind on repairs. They may not have flood insurance. Existing financial and health problems make it difficult for residents to cope with a flood, and they have nowhere else to go when something like this happens. When it comes to extreme heat, frontline communities are often living in densely populated urban areas that don't have tree cover. They have lack of green space. They may not have air conditioning. If they're doing manual labor outdoors, they're more exposed to extreme heat, elderly, sick, and the children are more susceptible. In terms of food, they probably have not much access to healthy food. In Detroit, we have a huge problem with grocery store deserts, just not much fresh food. You have to go a long ways to get it. If you're in a city, you probably don't have space to grow food. Or like for energy, the homes are poorly insulated, or you have existing health problems or lack of insurance. Having climate produce problems for you makes it all the more difficult for you to cope. Why do we lead, does equity lead with race? The most important reason that we talk about race so much when we're talking about equity is because of the huge wealth gap that exists between races in the United States. Here we see the median wealth for Black and white households between 1989 to 2019. This gap has really widened since it was starting to be tracked. And then there's like all households in the middle. But basically, white households have net wealth 10 times more than Black households on average. And when you have significantly less wealth, you are much less able to cope with the impacts of climate change. Equity is important not just for the people who are more severely impacted by climate change, but because the lack of equity is bad for our society overall, and it harms white households too. Heather McGee expresses this really beautifully in her book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. And she shares how in the 20th century, many American cities had these large public pools, and they were seen as a sign of community pride, and a lot of people loved going to these big pools. But then when civil rights successfully integrated these spaces, people didn't want these pools to be integrated. So they shut them down or they fill them in rather than having a pool that everyone can use. So she calls this the drain pool politics, where public amenities are seen as a zero-sum game. So if the thinking is like, if we let Black and brown people use it, then it becomes less for white people. Instead, what happens is everyone is deprived of these public amenities. And we see this happening in our access to healthcare, in public schools, in our response to COVID, and in how we respond to climate change. Often, instead of doing something that helps all people, the attitude is often, well, we don't want to help those people, and we would rather do without it altogether. So climate resilience, this definition comes from the International Panel on Climate Change, is the capacity of social, economic, and environmental systems to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbance, responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain their essential function, identity, and structure, while also maintaining the capacity for adaptation, learning, and transformation. So we add to this definition that climate resilience planning and action need to center the needs of vulnerable communities by applying principles and practices of belonging, equity, justice, diversity, and inclusion. And by centering the needs of vulnerable communities, we can really come up with the plan that is best for everyone. So for this project, we did a literature review of existing best practices in integrating equity into climate adaptation. We conducted interviews with experts and practitioners, and we had conversations and observations of community partners, EC Farm in Boston, and how they are integrating equity into climate adaptation. So we came up with a few guiding principles. One is focus on root causes, not just what are the impacts and what does it look like is a problem today, but what led to this problem. In the case of Detroit and similar cities, a lot of systemic racism and inequality and around the housing policies and development policies that happen in the city. Two is balancing power dynamics, looking at who is in power, who can make decisions these days, and how do we shift this balance of power so that it is more equitable and the people who are most impacted have a say. Fostering a sense of belonging in the process of planning, applying a place-based approach. So really tailoring your approach to the community that you're working with and letting the solutions emerge from the ground up, and evolving with the process. So this highlights that adaptation is a continuous learning process and it's a relationship building process. We can't determine it all from the beginning, but we really need to be able to evolve as the process continues. So the Climate Resilience Toolkit originally presented us with these 5 steps to climate adaptation. They were explore hazards, assess vulnerability and risk, investigate options, prioritize and plan, and implement the plan. So to this framework, we added some additional steps with the caveat that it's really not a linear process, but we generally present these 10 elements that need to be present, but depending on your situation, 8 may happen before 6, and you may need to repeat a few steps and so forth. So the first 2 steps are really super important, and that I try to highlight in my story, understanding the historic context, and 2, co-creating with the community. And you can understand historical context with the community, really seeking to understand the lived experiences of the people, and having them tell you, what they need and what solutions matter to them. Collaborating across sectors. Climate adaptation often is siloed in like the planning department or maybe an environmental department, but it really touches on every department in the government, and you need to collaborate across sectors as well as across scales. So locally, regionally, at the state level, various policy levels are in play. Equity goal setting, so making equity a framework for your whole plan, and having goals at the beginning on how you're going to do that. And then data connection analysis, assessing assets and vulnerabilities, et cetera, et cetera. And then 10, accountability is also really important in that equity often becomes deprioritized in an implementation when it's shown that, it's not as convenient or more costly to do this. So there needs to be some intentional plan set forth for how you're going to be accountable to the equity goals that you set. So in our guide, this is a resource that we share, the spectrum of community engagement from the Movement Center, Rosa Gonzalez, So she shows there's like 5 stances towards community, from ignore, where you're marginalizing the community, you know, you're denying them decision and denying their voice, to inform, where you're making all the decisions and then letting them know that something's happening, to consult, and then involve, you know, letting them be heard, and then collaborate, and then defer to. So in the last stage, the community has ownership over the project, and the people who are the climate adaptation experts really serve as the facilitator and the consultant to a process that is being owned by the community. So one of our conclusions is that centering equity is a dynamic and engaged approach that involves a reframing of principles and practices. So it can't just be done as a checklist. It's like, okay, equity, you know, have we done this? Have we included people of color? A lot of people are interested in, you know, like, what's the list? But it really needs to center the needs of the community and building a relationship. And that takes time. It takes a lot of work to build a relationship before the work can even begin. So this is the document that will be shared with you to everybody who attended. This is our practitioner's guide. It is available from kgax.org already, but like as a less pretty document. This new one that just got designed is not available yet, but it will be soon. Yeah, and my email is clarafang@yale.edu. I'm currently Deputy Director of Partnerships at Yale Program on Climate Change Communication.